Our 35th year of operation, and we decided that we'd like to do these reflections on a just society. This is the third that we've had this year. The first one we had John Boffa from Alice Springs. He's a doctor there, and we came and talked about Aboriginal health, particularly children's health there. The second one we had Professor Tony Vinson, who was presenting on some research that he's done with us around quality of life. And this third one we're very fortunate to have, where is he? There, Pedro Walpole, Dr. Pedro Walpole, meaning I'm telling you that because his background is as a scientist, an environmentalist, hydrologist, and he might say a little about that. Pedro's a Jesuit priest, and I've visited Pedro a few times in the Philippines, and the thing that I suppose that I was thinking about this morning, and I think the title of the organisation that he founded, Environmental Science for Social Change, probably sums up pretty neatly the approach. Pedro is a scientist, but it's always been about for social change. Pedro, his approach, and what you see very much when you visit his work there, is that the human being, the human person, is at the centre of this. It is for social change. So social justice and ecological justice are hand in glove, and I think it's that marriage that you see played out so beautifully there. Besides the base in Manila, the research centre, I visited Pedro at Mindanao in Bendum, a village high up in the mountains, and there you see the lived out reality of working with Indigenous people and assisting them in strengthening their own governance and sense of control of their life in terms of their own structures. And Pedro and his team of people do that so respectfully. They know that it's about identity, and culture is tied up so closely with belonging to the land, belonging to each other. And so everything flows out of that, whether it be the science, whether it be the education, whether it be the faith dimension, everything is connected in that. And so I'm delighted to introduce Pedro to present to us for a while, and the way that we do these breakfasts is for about 20 minutes. Pedro will give us some thoughts, some information to think about. I'll come back and we'll say, okay, we're going to have a moment's silence to reflect on that and to notice for ourselves what is it that we're left with, what's resonated with us, what's stuck, or what are we feeling a bit uncomfortable with even. And then we'll have small groups for about 10 minutes where we'll have an opportunity to share that, and then we'll just come back as a final few moments to the broader group in case there are any comments or questions or whatever that we want to share with each other. So that's the format, and we'll have you out of here by 9 as I know some people have got to go off to their next appointment. So please join me in welcoming Pedro Walpole.
Thank you. Good morning. It's a lovely morning to be here. I am interested in what's going to, in a sense, the responses after this in terms of where you are. I've just come from 3-4 days with the education institutions, the Jesuit education institutions that met in Perth to talk about their sense of sustainability, both in the grounds that they hold, with the youth that they teach, but how this spreads off of the campus. So it's very much practical in a way, and yet it's very much the human spirit of how we constantly learn anew to relate with the land. I was here about 2 years ago, and have continued in a sense with this understanding of reflection with the land. Trying really, as always, to balance the scientific knowledge we have, the cultural experience and identity, and where it is we can go forward with a balance in terms of really resources and resource use. So Julie gave us a fairly good run on my background. I want to go through a few things here. I am not going into detail on the strictly urban context, which is one thing I would, in a sense, like to do at a later occasion. But I started off 2 years ago in the bush hut, so that's a shot from down the slope in the bush hut where we began. This week I've been working through Jesuit Social Services, various meetings and activities, and really there is so much stress, as it were, in the world, or so much tension and action in the world. There is a great need to be able to begin with gratitude. If we're already standing with a brief in our hand and a whole range of meetings and activities to do during the day, it gets exhaustive. And if somehow there is not an energy that we can draw on, that we can be cared for, that we can be healed by, we're not going to be able to sustain it. So gratitude, basic sense of gratitude I will talk about. Steve Curtin was talking across many of the schools. They were meeting in different groups. I think there were 3 or 4 different groups that met. And he was talking about this incarnate sense of life and finding the best in self. Who am I called to be? The love of life and of creation, and to live out of this depth. I think it was Geraldine Doge who interviewed him for a sort of a, it wasn't a telecast, but a sort of a joint showing around the different venues of the education gatherings. So Steve was bringing this out and has been bringing this out, this connectivity that's very important through Jesuit education, which is one of the main apostolates we work with. So today I want to look a little at how this gratitude leads to engagement. I am now left with let me just sit with this and ask us to stop for a minute and just reflect on this to begin with. This is down on the yarrow, and to see whether in ourselves this morning we have the spiritual sources to foster our celebration of creation. What do I feel that means to motivate our commitment? So let us just for a moment be silent and allow those float around, and the images we have in our own mind, our own hearts. It's really in our lives difficult to feel. We can intellectually understand how the earth sustains us. But when we live in a city, we often lose that connectivity. And we need that connectivity back. Last night I was in the room above and we were looking out at the sunset on the landscape. And Melbourne is also such a beautiful city. There's a great grace that's there when you look over. Just that moment in transition every day where you, as it were, see the horizon in a new way, just between light and darkness. And the magnificence of Melbourne, of human interaction with life around, captures us. We need to, in a sense, draw that in and live that out. So we're faced with this question of a world and what we experience, and where we can go with it, how we connect with the larger whole, and what the strategy is. I think we're really being challenged in many ways today, whether it's the carbon tax that's just being discussed in recent weeks. I've just come back from the Rio discussions, which in many senses have been seen as a very paltry affair, and new efforts have to be made. One of the things that was coming very strong out of Latin American discussions is this buen vivir, this sense of what a good life is. We often talk of it in terms of well-being, not a better life. If the rest of the world struggles for a better life on the scale that the West has established, we'll need 3.5, 5 times the Earth we have at the moment to sustain such a world. So we have to find a whole range of strategies by which to live. The indigenous peoples and the sense of self-determination that's going on, particularly in the Asia region, is a real challenge, and is a real challenge to sustainable development. Most of the mineral exploration in Asia, of which is one of the main sources, is 70–80% on indigenous lands. And we have the biggest culturally diverse region in the world, in which people are beginning to get land recognition. But when you're after the stuff that's under the land, it becomes a whole other policy world. This organization in particular is working with identity and integrity in society of young people. But this is a problem throughout all our societies. We don't even have to imagine it if we think of what China is like. Just sheer numbers and industrial growth strategy. We can imagine the conditions under which young people have to envision a life in this world. Global finance crisis and the minimal acceptable change in neoliberalism is there. We know we haven't made the changes and the adaptations we have to. So the world is facing us with many questions, and with whether it's with the media, but also with an actually documentable sense of growing disasters around the world. We just look at the last 5 years, and it's It's a nation roll call in a sense as to where different disasters have occurred, where we never expected them. Obviously, nobody was prepared for what happened in Japan. Tectonic shifts, we've had typhoons around, and there's a huge effort to work with adaptation and reduce risk. I was talking with the Asian Development Bank, and they're at a point of where they say they're 96% into mitigation, which is the old strategy, and they have 4% of their resources going into adaptation, because they have no strategy for adaptation, and they wanted to do 50%, so they're a tenth of what's possible. I've come from Surabaya, the city of Surabaya in Indonesia, where a regional talk with the UN went on in terms of what a just city is. How do you allocate space? It's one of the biggest challenges we have, because it challenges the whole model of real estate. How is real estate going to continue and its impact in these cities on where people live and where people work? Usually it's the bottom 30% that cannot get the work and the living together, and so they subsist. In the past, people's relationships with the environment was shaped by power and the need to show dominance. If we take these old models of creation and dominion, yeah? And this was a language transition problem out of the industrial age. If we actually go back and examine these that have formed our societies in the last 200 years, we realize what has formed it more than we have previously understood. And these models of growth with the Industrial Revolution have not actually met our needs as human persons. There's still a great deal of misuse and exploitation. So today we're really called to build new relationships while we begin at home. We can put it through policy, but unless we put it through our own person and attitudes, and unless that's synced with other people, we're really not going to get out there and live differently. So environmental degradation shows our pattern of exploitation and misuse of natural resources. We're obviously we're hearing this, we're experiencing it. At what point is it the tipping bucket, or at what point people say, okay, I belong here. Not I want to get out of the environment problem, I want to get away from them. But no, this is a time where I must quieten and sense, okay, this is where I belong, this is where my children belong, those I cherish around me, and the world I start to relate with. So there's this ecological conversion. We've had many years of technology and growth and improvement, but we've really got to go back and do the conversion here and understand what it is to live anew on the land. There has to be, as it were, a new creation. But that new creation has to well up within us. And the new creation is really this call that comes from across the world and human experience, that we have to relate differently. It's not just in the science, it's in the human spirit. I have there to judge it, in a sense, to discern our landscape and the world around us and the people that we engage with. Help us to connect to the land and life. So this is where we've really got to establish a new language. We've got to encourage a positive response from our young people. This is why not only is social justice and ecological, environmental justice two sides, or actually often the one side. It's also the same people who bear the greatest burden and are challenged the greatest in terms of the young people of our societies. The Rio Plus 20 conference was opened by a young woman, a youth, addressing the government assembly, and very humbly but very truthfully saying, your decisions are what we have to work with. That transition is already occurring. If we don't develop these relationships in a new way, young people have to come into the response to the environment. How are we called to respond? Again, I think we recognize both the poor across the world in terms of their sustainability and their livelihood is diminishing greatly. How can we connect with this web of life? We have the concerns in terms of the refugees on their own land and their movement across that land. You've had many experiences here that have taken life and opportunity, with the floods on the one hand, the droughts on the others, and the horrendous fires that you've had. Again, how do we seek greater good of finding out how people can work with the gifts of creation, the mission to heal and to share? We're really challenged with this. This is where, in a sense, today in both, I think it's our schools across the country, across Asia, we're looking for something more than exposure for the youth. We're looking for an engagement. Because the youth, in one sense, young people have to learn an awful lot faster than they did before. Because the time measures what we're dealing with. I usually have graduates who come out from agriculture, who come out from ecological science, and they begin to work with me, and I say, look, this is great. Whatever you have learned, park it. Your first 6 months, your first year is really to listen anew. So don't feel awkward that you have to have the answers, no. You don't have to implement, establish yourself in the field. Don't worry at that. Establish yourself with the people first, whether it's government officials, whatever. Listen to them, let them teach you, and then start to bring in after a year all of your technical science, yeah, or your anthropology or whatever. Let that come in later, but take a break and learn to listen again. And this is what exposure is about. The head and the heart have to level off again. And that's usually what's going with exposure. Engagement is the head, the heart, and the hands. And the feet. Yeah? This has to, we have to move. And the ultimate challenge, in a sense, today is, are we willing to take up living sustainably? Not debate the words. I think we have worn out in the last 40 years, or the last 20 in particular, of sustainable development. Are we just willing to live sustainably? I see throughout Australia a great sense of quality of food. Can we grow that food? Can we have that quality of food coming from the land sustainably? You're fortunate here, you can breathe the air of Melbourne. I pass through the air of Manila. And it's a physical experience. And we have cities across the world like this moving. We're challenged in these integrations. So we're challenging our lifestyle, our accountability, our attitude. Attitude seems to be the biggest problem. We can agree to anything mentally over time. It comes from how we're managing our waste, what we're doing with it, how our agendas are coming together. This was something that was very interesting. The other day I was reading a review and I was trying to put how energy, snakes, batteries and telephones, the telephone directories come together. It's in John the 23rd, Ecological response. Yeah, they have such a great environment out there. They're managing their solar energy inputs to the system, but they also have snakes around. They're dealing with battery issues, which has been an issue for me for a long time. So people are getting it together. You've had a great deal in terms of the climate change, what's happening, the approaches that are there. You have the Australian response that is coming up. One last thing I just wanted to look at before I go to the last point is, this is not something I want to go into detail with, but what I wanted to draw up is, are we in our, whether it's per capita income or in our dynamics, willing to make this sort of a shift for this sort of a variance in result? These are the tipping buckets. These are the changes that can be there. We can really make differences of a significant level. And this is really what the challenge in Rio has been. A few countries are coming up to the mark in 18 months. There will be a new real challenge left. But it's really in our own lives. Am I willing to take that little less and understand actually that there's an awful lot more that I can partake in if I have a sense of gratitude rather than always the urgency. Values formation is something that flows out of this sense of attitudinal change. The attitude affects the values and the selection and the concepts that become meaningful. Over the week, these are some of the questions that I have been sharing with people. It's primarily how much of this can we identify with, how much more of this relationship with the land and the air we breathe can I give space to. There's so little space we give to our breathing until we have a breathing problem. There's so little space we have given at times to what we eat, yeah? Where we walk, what we do. So in one sense, to be in touch and to identify. I think this is the challenge that we're faced with.
So let's just take a moment, leave those questions up, Pedro, and let's just take a moment to reflect on what we've heard and to note what might be touching us or standing out for us, and I'll give instructions for the next